The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone. Thanks for attending our first ever webinar. In this session today, Leilani Burrow, the Executive Director of ID, will be discussing the latest analysis of the incredible population growth that's happening in Victoria. We've got a lot to cover in a very short session, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat pane and we'll endeavour to get to them at the end. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Leilani.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for sharing your lunchtime with me. And I'd like to thank Matthew Deacon and the population forecasting team at ID for the research that I am about to present. I'm just going to jump straight in and just give a quick background on what you'll be learning today. I'm going to give a little background about ID and how we can help for those of you that aren't familiar with us. And then we'll jump straight into the presentation and look at the rise of Victoria, how we're changing, and we'll take a historical view, then look at when things started to change, and then where we're heading to in the future. But really what I want to get to is how you can then apply this knowledge to individual and specific locations around Melbourne and Victoria. And then we'll use that method to do a very quick case study looking at forecasting demand, in this case for schooling, and then just recap on some of the tools that I've used and some resources that we have available to help you. So just briefly, ID are a team of population experts, which is kind of an unusual thing to be. We are Australia's largest team of demographers, spatial analysts, population forecasters and urban planners. And what that really means is that we spend a lot of time studying and understanding how cities are growing and changing. And in particular, we quantify this knowledge into detailed population forecasts. So we're here to tell you about the future. We deliver our analysis online using spatial tools, so mapping and so on, so that you can really quickly see the relationships between the demand for particular products and services and your supply of those products and services into the marketplace. Our clients use this knowledge to decide where and when to invest in infrastructure, services and their marketing effort. And so our clients include all sorts of organisations that provide services to the community, like the 300 councils that we work with Australia-wide. But we also work with people in the education sector, property, retail, utilities, community sports, aged care, really anything where you're providing services to people. So what's happening in Victoria? Well, the first thing to note really is that it is growing at quite a staggering rate, and it is growing sort of out of character in a sense. If you have a look at this chart, what you can see is that traditionally Victoria grows at a slower rate than the rest of Australia, and that has changed since about 2001, where we started to level peg with the rest of Australia. And I guess in some ways we're largely talking about our bigger neighbour, New South Wales, and then actually in fact exceeding it at about the time of the GFC and again at this time. So what's driving that growth? Is it people coming from overseas? Is it women having more babies? Is it people living longer? Is it people coming from interstate? Is it to do with housing? Is it to do with, you know, the fact that we're building more here than in other places? What is actually driving the growth? And I think what we're going to find is that it's basically all of the above. And what we need to unpack is what's sort of sitting behind those changes. So let's just have a look historically, and there's a lovely picture that one of our forecasters found of Leicester Street in Fitzroy, which we're very familiar with because we're based in Collingwood. And you can see what it used to look like. And so just have that kind of image in your mind as we look at the historical view. And we're demographers, so we like charts. So I'm going to skip through quite a number of charts today. Don't worry too much about the detail, just pick up the main story as I go through. And the main story of this chart is just showing you that in 1971, which is the blue bars, the biggest age group, the biggest age cohort was 0 to 4-year-olds, babies. By 2001, the biggest cohort was 30 to 34-year-olds. So basically, those babies had grown up. And really, what we're looking at here is the baby boomers and their anticipated sort of move into old age as we go forward in time. So we were moving from being a very young population to a much more middle-aged population. And this chart, which is really just showing the same numbers in a different way, depicts that very clearly. So over that time period, that 30-year time period between 71 and 2001, we were having fewer children and basically becoming middle-aged and older. So what then happened? So between 2001 and now really, and today, there's been a real shift in the underlying demographic drivers that are at play. And in a way, the picture here, so here's the old picture of Leicester Street, and this is that same spot today, and we went and took a photograph of it. And really that tells a story in some ways of the gentrification of the inner suburbs, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that. But there are underlying demographic shifts that are driving that. So we're going to start by talking about some of the things that are driven by economic changes. And the first one of those has been a big boost in the number of people coming into Victoria from overseas. So if you have a look at this chart, just have a look at the pattern. So you can see that traditionally Victoria gets around about sort of 20 to 30,000 people from overseas to boost our population each year. And that this follows cycles, and those cycles tend to follow economic booms and troughs. So there's the recession that we had to have. And that really, we never really peaked at much over 40,000 in terms of population growth through migration until 2009, the height of the global financial crisis, when suddenly we peaked at double that, 80,000 population at that time. And what you can see is that really since 2001, migration into Victoria has doubled, and that it's now, as the economy slows, it's coming off its peaks, and they're going into another growth phase. And you can see that we're looking at a step change where the growth is happening at a much higher rate, and we don't anticipate that will really ever will shift back down to this in the foreseeable future. So we're going through overseas migration. One of the interesting things about overseas migrants is they bring young people into the population. And when you bring in quite a lot of young people into the population, that is pretty helpful if you've got an aging population. So you can see this is the age of people that migrate in from overseas. And they're young, skilled workers, and they're children. When we're looking at Victoria in comparison to other states, how does it compare in terms of its share of overseas migration? Well, traditionally, New South Wales is the big winner when it comes for overseas migration, and Victoria is a very far second. But you can see that there's been a real convergence between the states, with Victoria and New South Wales pretty well level pegging at around 25 to 30% in more recent times. The other component of migration, so people coming into the country, is through interstate migration. So traditionally, Victoria has actually lost people to other states. So during that recession, we lost almost 30,000 people. We exported them to other states of Australia. But by 2014, we're gaining nearly 10,000 through interstate migration. So that's a very significant difference if you compare our worst period to our best period. And probably more significant, though, is just that the chart has shifted from all the bars heading downwards to quite a number of the bars heading in an upward direction. So we are now attracting people from interstate and not losing people interstate. So why is this happening? Well, there are a few reasons, and they're largely economic. So Victoria is very attractive to tertiary students, as is Australia. We've been going through a very long period of sustained economic growth, and we were particularly resilient through the GFC, as our politicians love to tell us. Our sort of competitor countries, particularly for population have not performed as well. So we're gaining population from places like Ireland. The mining boom obviously has been driving this, driven by growth in the Chinese economy, and also our higher interest rates have encouraged foreign investment into Australia. Now, some of these things are actually in flux at the moment, but those have been the key drivers over that period. So those are the economic drivers. What about the social drivers? And one of the key indicators that things are happening differently socially is the birth rate. And traditionally, Victoria has had about 60,000 births, that's the orange bars, every year. And so despite the fact that the population has been growing, the number of births has stayed fairly stable. And that's because the birth rate, or the fertility rate, has been slowly dropping off since the 1970s. Now, demographers anticipated that it would continue to decline, as it had in other Western countries. But in fact, in about 2001, it started to turn around and the fertility rate started to go back up. And all of a sudden, we're looking at, again, a significant step shift in the number of children that are being born in Victoria every year. So we've gone from 60,000 to 70, and now we're hitting around 75,000 a year. So that's an extra 10,000 babies every year that we need to find childcare for, and that soon we'll be needing to find primary care, secondary, etc., etc. And that's why, you know, those of you who are parents will be very familiar with the kind of discussion about how you get your child into childcare at the moment. So what is, and people often ask us, you know, is this all to do with Peter Costello's incentives for having children? And maybe that has a small impact, but I think that really sits within a whole context of change, which is more flexible working arrangements that enable women to go back into the workplace, that women and men now share responsibility for taking care of children much more than they used to, and that actually we've had low unemployment and high demand for labour, so there is demand for women to go back into the workforce as well. And this has all been helped along by improved access to childcare. So, in terms of population growth, what does all of this mean? The population growth by age, which is key to service providers, is that where we were looking at just having big change in the number of baby boomers and old people in the population, we now have three kind of big changes. The baby boomers are still aging and going through the population, but we have a big influx of young people through migration and a big influx of babies through both migration and through more women having children. So what does it mean for the future? And really the future looks a bit like this. It's a combination of where we've come from and where we're heading. And so what the future looks like in terms of age structure is this continued migration of the baby boomers through the age cohorts. We're seeing a continued growth through migration, and then the people that arrived previously are aging in place. So now we've got a big cohort in this young working age population. These are the babies that have been born in the last few years that are moving through the population, and then these are the ones coming in behind them. So we're seeing fewer, but still large numbers. So we call this the three growth markets that we're seeing in the population out into the future. And when you look at that across the whole kind of time period, you can see we're looking at a much more stable age structure than we were facing back in 2011. Just very quickly, because just comparing this to other countries, you can see, I'll just highlight Japan here, and you can see that Japan, which doesn't have a migration policy and has very low fertility rates, really having a big challenge with an aging population, and Australia doing pretty well on that front. So what does all of that mean for the urban landscape? Have we been building enough houses to put all these new people in? And the answer in short is no. Here is building approvals in grey, population growth in orange. So they're starting to catch up, but they've definitely fallen quite far behind. So where is everybody living? Because they're here, and we haven't been building enough houses. So that basically means that they must be living more people in each house, and you can see that the average household size, particularly in Melbourne, has gone up. So you would kind of think that that would mean, sorry, just going back to this one, that if the average number of people living in a house is going up, that we'd be building bigger houses, probably out on the fringe. But another very substantial shift that's been happening across metropolitan Melbourne is that for the first time really in our kind of substantial growth history, we've shifted from being a city that grows its population on the fringes to one which is building houses in the established inner areas. So if you have a look at 2006 to 2011, Greenfield was still winning as it had been historically. Between 11 and 16, and these are real figures, not forecasts, for the first time, established dwellings totally outstripped greenfield development. That's a radical shift if you look at the difference between those two periods. And we're forecasting that will continue into the future until we really run out of opportunity, I guess, in the established areas. So why is this happening? And again, I'm just going to touch on this, but there has been a shift in the development industry. So with the introduction of developer contributions, developers on the fringe are expected to contribute a lot more and invest in place in their fringe developments. On the fringe, we're building much smaller residential lots. People are completely building out on their land and then relying on public open space to provide gardens for their children. And there's been a displacement, therefore, of small and medium-sized builders into the inner and middle suburbs because you need to have a big development company to build these fringe developments. And this is just an interesting view of Truganina in Wyndham. This is it in 2009, and this shows how quickly we build these suburbs. And also just notice how tightly packed the houses are and how little open space there is in people's individual gardens as that suburb gets built out. And so as forecasters, it's our job to monitor those developments very closely so that we can forecast the future population of that site before it's actually happened. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the forecasts. Within the inner areas, there was a massive sell-off of school sites and utilities land in the 90s, which created available land. Deindustrialisation creates available warehouse space. So we now have the ability or the land to build in the inner cities. There's been a lack of investment in public transport on the fringe, which is driving people back into the established areas. And really, there's been a lot of government push towards established community development. And so we're getting lots and lots of development right throughout Melbourne that I'm sure those of you that live here will be familiar with. And what's really interesting about it is it's not just happening in dense kind of, go-to areas like Fitzroy, Collingwood, etc. It's happening further out. And this map shows you, I think this is a suburb where our head forecaster Matthew lives. And so here he's mapped all of the different identified sites going forward from 2011 in Carnegie, which is hardly, an inner city area. So you can see that concentration of development. So just to conclude, before we just show you a quick example, there's been a transformation of the population. It's been growing fast, it's becoming more youthful. This is being driven by economic and social factors. Then the growth is really increasing in established parts of Melbourne. And all of this is quite volatile, which means that you need to do timely updates to population forecasts so you can monitor all of this as we go forward. So we've talked big picture, and now I want to show you how we can drill down, and I'm just going to open this up for you, how we can drill down and look at this in more detail. So just bear with me while I open up this site. And this is something that we call ID Placemaker, and it's a spatial application where we present and show the results of our forecasting work, and our clients use this application as well. So this is actually an application that we built for the Catholic Education Office, and it shows Victoria, and we're going to just use this to have a look at an example of forecasting demand within Victoria for high school age children, because that was one of the groups that we can see is there's going to be a big demand for high schools in the not too distant future based on what we just saw before. So I'm just going to put some data on here, and I'm going to choose children age 12 to 17, and I'm just going to look at where they were in 2011 in terms of the greatest number. Okay, so you can see obviously concentrated around Melbourne and the growth areas actually. And as I drill in, I'm now looking at local government areas, and you can see that there's a strong concentration, strong growth in Casey, strong growth out in Geelong. And I'm going to continue to drill down and have a look at this in a little bit more detail in Casey. So I'm going to put some schools on. So let's have a look at secondary schools. And just drilling in a little bit further. And sorry, I just lost my train of thought then. Let's go back out. I just want to go down a little bit further. Here we are. Here's Casey. This is what I was expecting. So Casey's got a lot of growth, but really we need to know where that growth is happening in Casey. And I'll just pull this up a little bit higher so you can see. And you can see that now we're looking at what's called SA2s, or sort of suburbs, and we can see that in 2011 the majority of high school age kids were up in sort of the Berwick area. And yet here we've got two schools that are down in Cranbourne East. And I happen to know that this school is brand new, and I think it just opened this year. And you go, well, why has it been built down here? Let's just have a look at the future of this area. So let's just have a drill further in. I'm going to drill further in again. And I'm going to put some enrolment data on. I'm going to drill in one more time to get down to really detailed data. So now we're looking at where the 12 to 17-year-olds are by tiny geography, kind of a city block, almost, it's like an SA1. And you can see that most of them are around this campus, which is the first campus of St. Peter's College, and here's the second campus, which has just been built. And if I put some enrolment data on, and we're looking at 2011 data, the forecast, so I'll look at 2011 data, and you can see this is where all the kids are today. Were coming from in 2011, and so you can see them coming out of these areas where there are lots of 12 to 17-year-olds, which is what you would expect. So now I'm going to go forward in time, and I'm going to go to 2014. And just remember that 2014 is actually a forecast because the census hasn't been conducted since 2011. And I'm going to apply that to the map, and you can see the shift of 12 to 17-year-olds around here. And if I look at the enrolments for that period, you can see that the kids are also starting to come from further afield. And we're now getting closer to where our secondary school is on, our new secondary school is. So I'm just going to change, sorry, I know I'm a bit short on time, so I'm just going to quickly change this so that you can see it a bit more easily. I'll make them small points. That's better. Okay, so now I'm going to have a look at where our forecast enrolment is going to be in future. So where are the students going to come from in the future? So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to have a look at where they're going to be coming from by 2020. And so now you can see that they're much more concentrated around our new campus, and then in fact by 2030 you're really starting to see that the development front has shifted, and we've now got children living much further out to the west and much closer to our new campus. So you can see that actually the Catholic Education Office have timed the establishment of that new campus, of that school, pretty nicely as that front shifts across. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a taste of how we use our population forecasts to really help people determine the delivery of services and so on across their, depending on what they're doing. So we work with aged care providers, we work with youth services providers, we work with sporting organisations who want to understand where to draw people for sporting events, and so on and so forth. So that gives you a little taste of the kind of analysis that we do, and that was based on SAFY, which is our small area forecast information, and SAFY is what we use to really talk about the rise of Victoria, and then we were showing SAFY in ID Placemaker, which is our spatial mapping and reporting tool. So SAFY itself is this, it stands for Small Area Forecast Information, and it's very, very granular population forecast. So what we do is we forecast every single one of these tiny little squares, 7,185 of them across the whole of Victoria, and we're able to tell you in each of those squares what the population, how many dwellings there will be, what the population will be, what the age of that population will be, and what kind of households they will form for every year from 2011 to 2036. And that's what our clients use to make confident decisions about where to put their services and infrastructure in the future. These are the kind of organisations that use SAFY. So it's used extensively in the development industry, the retail industry, the education sector. And if you move to the other end of the spectrum, the age spectrum, there's the aged care sector. And if you keep going, you actually end up at the cemetery sector, which is where we need to forecast how much land we need to bury all these people or cremate them in the future. And we also work across the not-for-profit sector, and we've been doing a substantial amount of work in the sports arena as well. So that kind of is it for me. I'd again like to thank you for sharing your lunch with me. I'd like to point you in the direction of some more resources. So if you go to ID's website, we have a demographic resource centre where you can access lots of demographic information for free. We're very prolific, so we write substantially on these subjects because we're quite passionate about them. So you'll find ebooks there, you can subscribe to a newsletter, and you can look at other case studies of how this work is applied. And if you want to learn about this stuff regularly, subscribe to our blog. We publish there at least twice a week, and it's full of all sorts of interesting information. We're doing quite a lot about Syrian and other refugees just at the moment. Also, please feel free to contact me if you have any questions following this seminar. And I think I have just enough time to answer a couple of questions. So I've got one from Andrew McLaren on interstate migration, and he's asking if migration from Victoria was moving to Queensland. Good question. And yes, traditionally we have lost a lot of people to Queensland, Andrew. But over the period of the GFC, that kind of hemorrhaging to Queensland stopped, largely because Queensland was much more affected by the GFC than Victoria. And so Queensland was heavily affected by loss of tourism and also actually construction employment. And so many people either came back from Queensland or basically didn't go there. It's starting to pick up again now, migration back to Queensland, but it really did go through quite a hiatus during the 2000 and sort of 6 onwards. Okay. So if there are no other questions, please feel free to, there's an ebook on that subject. We'll be sharing the slides with people, and the webinar will also be recorded. So if you want to revisit any of that information, it'll be available from our website. And thank you again for joining me.